the $400 billion energy alliance that's reshaping the global order. In early September, the world's eyes were fixed on Beijing as China showcased its military strength through a meticulously choreographed parade. Rows of soldiers marched in perfect synchronization. Cutting-edge weaponry rolled through the streets. The spectacle was designed to impress, and it did. But while cameras captured tanks and fighter jets, something far more consequential was happening behind closed doors. Just 24 hours before that parade, representatives from 3 nations gathered quietly to sign an agreement that would reverberate across continents for decades to come. China, Russia, and Mongolia had finalized a 30-year natural gas partnership, a deal valued at more than $900 billion. To put that figure in perspective, this single agreement represents one of the largest energy transactions in human history. It's not just about pipelines and gas flows. It's about the fundamental restructuring of how energy moves around the planet, who controls it, and which nations hold leverage in an increasingly fragmented world order. Here's what makes this moment particularly striking. While these 3 countries were cementing their energy future together, Europe was racing in the opposite direction, desperately trying to sever its decades-long dependence on Russian gas. European leaders have set an ambitious deadline to eliminate Russian energy imports entirely within the next few years. And now, China appears positioned to absorb nearly all of what Europe is rejecting. This isn't a story about pipelines alone. It's about geopolitics, economic survival, and the quiet reshaping of alliances that will define the 21st century. Today, we're going to explore why this deal took nearly 10 years to negotiate, what obstacles nearly killed it, and what it means for everyone from European households facing higher heating bills to policymakers in Washington watching their influence shift eastward. Let's begin with understanding just how critical Russia is to the global energy equation. Russia, the energy superpower the world can't ignore. When we talk about global energy, Russia isn't just a player, it's one of the most dominant forces on the board. According to the most recent data from 2024, Russia sits on approximately 80 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That's roughly 5% of all the oil we know exists on Earth. Every single day, Russian oil fields produce around 11 million barrels of crude oil, which represents about 11% of the world's total daily output. Think about that for a moment. 1 out of every 10 barrels of oil consumed globally, whether it's fueling cars in California, powering factories in Japan, or heating homes in India, comes from Russia. But oil, as significant as it is, isn't Russia's most powerful card. That distinction belongs to natural gas. Russia currently holds 37.5 trillion cubic meters of proven natural gas reserves. This staggering volume accounts for nearly 20% of all known gas reserves on the planet. In practical terms, Russia has the capacity to supply the world with natural gas for generations to come, maintaining stable exports even as demand fluctuates. For decades, Europe has been the primary beneficiary of this abundance. Before recent geopolitical upheavals, the relationship between Russia and Europe on energy was remarkably stable and mutually beneficial. More than half of all Russian oil exports flowed westward into European refineries and storage facilities. But it was natural gas where the dependence became truly profound. Each year, Russia pumped approximately 150 billion cubic meters of natural gas into Europe through an intricate network of pipelines. These weren't just commercial transactions. They represented the lifeblood of European industry, the warmth in millions of homes during brutal winters, and the foundation of economic planning for entire nations. Germany, Europe's largest economy, relied on Russian gas more heavily than any other nation. At its peak, over half of Germany's natural gas came directly from Russian fields through pipelines that had been built during the Cold War and expanded afterward. German industries, from chemical plants to steel manufacturers, had built their competitive advantages around access to cheap, reliable Russian energy. But Germany wasn't alone in this dependency. Italy, Austria, and Hungary found themselves even more exposed. These countries relied on Russian pipeline gas for approximately 80% of their total natural gas supply. When Russian gas flowed, their economies hummed. When questions arose about that supply, panic set in. This was the landscape before everything changed. The rupture. How Europe and Russia's energy marriage collapsed. In February 2022, Russian military forces crossed into Ukrainian territory, triggering the largest land war in Europe since 1945. The invasion sent shockwaves through the international system, but perhaps nowhere were the consequences felt more immediately than in the energy sector. Western nations, led by the United States and the European Union, moved swiftly to impose what they described as unprecedented economic sanctions on Russia. The goal was clear: cut off the financial resources that enabled Moscow's military operations and pressure the Russian government to reverse course. Energy became the primary battlefield of this economic war. The European Union announced it would completely ban imports of Russian oil, a dramatic reversal after decades of integration. Shortly thereafter, the Group of Seven advanced economies imposed a price cap mechanism designed to limit how much revenue Russia could earn from oil sales to any remaining buyers. Then came the moment that symbolized the rupture more than any other: the Nord Stream pipelines. These twin pipelines, running beneath the Baltic Sea directly from Russia to Germany, had been the crown jewel of Russian-European energy cooperation. They bypassed traditional transit countries, provided Germany with direct access to Russian gas, and represented billions in investment and political capital. In September 2022, mysterious explosions tore through sections of both Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. The blasts occurred in international waters, and to this day, the question of responsibility remains contentious. What isn't in dispute is the result. The pipelines that had symbolized energy interdependence were now useless sections of twisted metal on the ocean floor. Gas flows through Nord Stream had already been declining amid the escalating tensions. After the explosions, they stopped entirely. Another critical supply route, the pipeline running through Ukrainian territory, became increasingly unstable as the war ground on. Stations were damaged. Transit agreements became political footballs. The infrastructure that had reliably moved Russian gas westward for decades was now fragile and uncertain. From 2022 through 2025, Western nations progressively tightened the screws. New rounds of sanctions targeted Russian energy companies, their executives, and anyone facilitating their operations. European leaders, facing domestic pressure to take a harder line, committed to a timeline. By 2027, Russian energy would be completely phased out. For Russia, the message was unmistakable. The European market that had anchored its energy export strategy for half a century was closing its doors. Moscow needed alternatives, and it needed them quickly. The Eastern Pivot, Russia's decade-long courtship of China. The idea of redirecting Russian energy exports toward Asia wasn't actually born out of the Ukraine crisis. It's something that had been discussed in energy ministries and corporate boardrooms for years, honestly. But until recently, it had remained largely theoretical. As early as 2015, Russian and Chinese officials began serious discussions about what would later become known as the Power of Siberia 2 natural gas pipeline. The concept was ambitious. Construct a massive pipeline stretching over 3,000 kilometers from Russia's Yamal Peninsula, way out in the frozen expanses of Siberia, southward through Mongolian territory, and finally into northeastern China. The proposed capacity was substantial: 50 billion cubic meters of natural gas each year, which would represent a significant chunk of China's import needs. The estimated investment required: $90 billion. This wasn't just a pipeline project. It was really a bet on the future of energy geopolitics, a massive reorientation of infrastructure that had been built over decades to serve European markets. But here's the puzzle. If this project was proposed back in 2015, why are we only now, 10 years later, seeing it come to fruition? The answer reveals just how complicated major energy projects become when they intersect with national interests, corporate profits, and geopolitical calculations. In the early stages, Russia simply didn't view the eastern route as a priority. The logic was straightforward and, from Moscow's perspective at the time, entirely reasonable. Europe was buying massive volumes of gas, paying predictable prices, and the infrastructure was already in place. The business case for spending nearly $100 billion to reach Chinese customers, who were already sourcing gas from Central Asia and the Middle East, seemed weak. Moreover, the existing power of Siberia, one pipeline, which had been completed in 2019, was still ramping up to full capacity. Russian energy planners saw no urgent need to commit to another massive infrastructure project when their primary market remained stable. But beyond strategic priorities, there were practical obstacles that nearly killed the project entirely. Price negotiations became a major sticking point. China, leveraging its position as a potential major buyer, pushed for natural gas prices that were close to Russia's heavily subsidized domestic rates. Beijing's negotiators argued that they had alternative suppliers and that Russia needed China more than China needed Russia. Russian energy companies, particularly Gazprom, pushed back hard. They insisted on negotiating prices based on what they had been charging European customers, a significantly higher benchmark. For years, neither side would budge. Then there was the question of the route itself, which became surprisingly contentious. Russia favored a path that would cut through Mongolia. This route would reduce the total pipeline length by approximately 1,000 kilometers, saving enormous construction costs and reducing technical complexity. From an engineering standpoint, it made perfect sense. China, however, had reservations. Routing through Mongolia would mean paying transit fees to a third country, fees that could be adjusted or used as leverage in future negotiations. There was also the geopolitical concern. Adding Mongolia as a necessary link in the supply chain created an additional potential point of pressure or disruption. Chinese planners preferred an alternative, a route that would begin at a small Russian border town, pass through Zabaikalsk, and enter Chinese territory directly. No third-party involvement, no transit fees, complete bilateral control. The problem? This route was longer and significantly more expensive to construct. Mongolia, meanwhile, wasn't content to be a passive transit corridor. Mongolian officials saw an opportunity. If Russia and China were going to build a massive pipeline through their territory, Mongolia wanted substantial compensation, transit revenues that could provide a windfall for their economy. At the same time, they were reluctant to shoulder construction costs for infrastructure sections within their borders. 3 countries, 3 different priorities, 3 sets of negotiators, each trying to maximize their own benefits while minimizing costs and risks. Years passed, meetings were held, memorandums were drafted and shelved. Western media began reporting that the Power of Siberia 2 project was effectively dead, a victim of incompatible interests and the complexity of trilateral negotiations. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, everything changed. The breakthrough, what finally made the deal possible. In 2025, during the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, something remarkable happened. After nearly a decade of stalled negotiations, fractured talks, and plenty of skeptical headlines, China and Russia announced they had reached a comprehensive agreement. The summit itself was significant, a gathering of nations that represent nearly half of the world's population and a substantial share of global economic output. But the energy agreement signed there went way beyond just symbolic cooperation. According to Alexei Miller, the chief executive officer of Gazprom, Russia's state-controlled energy giant, representatives from Russia, China, and Mongolia had formally signed a tripartite memorandum. The document committed all 3 nations to jointly develop 2 major natural gas pipeline projects with a cooperation period spanning 30 years. The total value of the agreement? More than $900 billion. Let that number sink in for a moment. This is one of the largest commercial agreements ever negotiated between sovereign nations. It actually dwarfs many countries' annual GDP. It represents a commitment that will extend well into the 2050s, binding these three nations together through energy infrastructure that, honestly, cannot easily be unwound. So what exactly are they building? The first pipeline is Power of Siberia 2, the long-discussed project that will originate from Russia's Yamal Peninsula, traverse Mongolian territory, and terminate in northeastern China. The section of this pipeline that crosses through Mongolia is sometimes referred to separately as the Eastern Union Pipeline, though they are part of the same integrated system. According to the signed agreement, construction is scheduled for completion by 2030. Once operational, this pipeline will deliver 50 billion cubic meters of natural gas to China every single year. But that's not all. Russia also committed to expanding the existing Power of Siberia 1 pipeline, which has been operating since 2019. Current capacity stands at 38 billion cubic meters annually. Under the new agreement, this will be increased to 44 billion cubic meters, a boost of 6 billion cubic meters per year. Do the math. Once both pipelines reach full operational capacity, Russia will be supplying China with a combined total of approximately 106 billion cubic meters of natural gas every year. Using current market prices, roughly $28 per thousand cubic meters, China will be purchasing over $30 billion worth of Russian natural gas annually. Multiply that by the 30-year contract period, and you arrive at a total exceeding $900 billion, possibly reaching as high as $1 trillion, depending on price fluctuations and contract terms. One critical detail in the agreement. Russia has committed to pricing its gas exports to China below what it previously charged European customers. This concession was essential to securing Chinese buy-in and represents a significant strategic calculation by Moscow. They're accepting lower per-unit margins in exchange for volume, long-term security, and, a guaranteed alternative to European markets. For Mongolia, the deal brings the prospect of transit fees and, potentially, direct access to Russian natural gas for domestic consumption, something that could transform their energy security and economic development trajectory. But this raises a crucial question. Can China actually replace what Europe is refusing to buy? The global shuffle. Can China fill Europe's shoes? The European Union has set a clear target. By 2027, Russian energy imports should be eliminated entirely. It's an ambitious goal, driven by both moral imperatives related to the Ukraine conflict and strategic desires to reduce dependence on what many European leaders now view as an unreliable partner. Before sanctions took hold, Russia was supplying Europe with approximately 150 billion cubic meters of natural gas each year. That's the baseline, the volume that European economies, industries, and households had structured themselves around. Now, according to the agreements between Russia and China, the combined pipeline capacity will deliver 106 billion cubic meters to China annually. That's roughly 70% of what Europe was importing at its peak. From a purely volumetric perspective, China can indeed absorb the vast majority of what Russia is losing in European markets. The infrastructure is being built specifically to handle these volumes. The contracts are being signed with 30-year horizons. The commitment is real and substantial, but volume isn't the whole story. For Europe, the decision to cut ties with Russian energy has come with significant consequences that policymakers are still grappling with. After reducing imports from Russia, European nations had to scramble for alternatives. The United States stepped up exports of liquefied natural gas, or LNG. Middle Eastern suppliers increased their shipments. Norway, already a major supplier, maximized its production. Yet none of these alternatives could fully replicate what Russian pipeline gas had provided: massive volume, predictable delivery, and crucially, competitive pricing. American LNG, while abundant, is significantly more expensive than Russian pipeline gas. The process of liquefying gas, shipping it across the Atlantic in specialized tankers, and then regasifying it at European terminals adds substantial costs at every step. According to various industry analyses, natural gas prices in some European countries have increased by more than 50% compared to pre-sanction levels. For ordinary citizens, this means higher heating bills. For industries, particularly energy-intensive sectors like chemicals, steel, and fertilizers, it means reduced competitiveness, and in some cases, decisions to reduce production or relocate operations to regions with cheaper energy. The data tells a stark story. Between 2022 and 2024, total crude oil imports to the European Union dropped by approximately 30%. While this reduction was partly intentional as part of sanctions policy, it has created genuine hardship. Some Eastern European nations, which had been almost entirely dependent on Russian gas, have faced periodic supply shortages. The economic burden has been substantial. Estimates vary, but some analysts suggest that the energy crisis triggered by the rupture with Russia has cost European economies hundreds of billions of euros in lost growth, increased costs, and economic dislocation. Europe is adapting. New LNG terminals are being built. Energy efficiency measures are being accelerated. Renewable energy deployment is being prioritized like never before. But the transition is painful, expensive, and far from complete. Meanwhile, for China, this pipeline agreement represents much more than just securing additional gas supplies. China's energy calculus: why Russian gas matters more than ever. China is the world's largest energy consumer. That title comes with both opportunities and vulnerabilities. Each year, China consumes approximately 380 billion cubic meters of natural gas. Of that total, more than 40%, over 150 billion cubic meters, must be imported from foreign suppliers. This dependence on imports makes energy security one of Beijing's highest strategic priorities. Historically, China has diversified its natural gas sources across several suppliers and routes. Central Asian nations, particularly Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, have been critical partners, delivering gas through pipelines that traverse the region. Turkmenistan, in particular, had been China's most reliable supplier of pipeline gas for years, with stable flows and long-term contracts. But recently, cracks have appeared in this arrangement. In 2024, Kazakhstan made the decision to significantly reduce its natural gas exports to China. The reduction was dramatic, a 40% decrease compared to the previous year. The reasons cited included domestic supply needs and infrastructure constraints, but the result was the same. A major supplier suddenly became far less dependable. Even more concerning for Chinese energy planners was Uzbekistan's decision to completely halt natural gas exports. Uzbekistan, which had once provided nearly 10% of China's pipeline gas imports, simply closed the tap. Domestic priorities, political considerations, and energy balance issues all played a role, but Beijing was left scrambling to make up the shortfall. These disruptions underscored a reality that Chinese strategists had long understood, but now confronted with new urgency. Diversification isn't just about having multiple suppliers. It's about having reliable suppliers with both the capacity and political willingness to maintain long-term commitments. Russia, despite its own complexities and geopolitical alignments, offers something increasingly rare: vast reserves, existing infrastructure, and now a desperate need for Asian markets that makes it a highly motivated partner. By securing 106 billion cubic meters annually from Russia, China isn't just filling a supply gap, it's fundamentally restructuring its energy security architecture. But there's another dimension to this that goes beyond mere supply and demand calculations. It's about geography, shipping routes, and what military strategists call choke points. Traditionally, a significant portion of China's imported natural gas has arrived by sea. Tankers carrying LNG depart from the Persian Gulf, navigate through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical oil and gas transit points, cross the Indian Ocean, and squeeze through the narrow Malacca Strait before finally reaching Chinese ports. This route, while established and well-traveled, presents a fundamental vulnerability. The United States Navy maintains dominant presence in both the Indian Ocean and the waters surrounding the Malacca Strait. In the event of a serious geopolitical confrontation between Washington and Beijing, a scenario that, while hopefully unlikely, is no longer unthinkable, these sea lanes could potentially be disrupted or even blockaded. For Chinese military and strategic planners, this represents an unacceptable risk. Energy supplies that can be interdicted by a potential adversary are, by definition, not secure. Land-based pipelines from Russia change this equation fundamentally. Gas flowing through pipes buried in Siberian tundra and Mongolian steppes cannot be blocked by naval forces. There are no maritime choke points. No aircraft carriers can interdict the supply. Short of physically destroying the pipeline infrastructure itself, an act that would constitute a dramatic escalation of any conflict, the gas continues to flow. This is why the power of Siberia 2 pipeline represents more than an economic transaction for China. It's a strategic hedge against geopolitical uncertainty. It's an insurance policy in a world where great power competition is intensifying. It's a recognition that in the 21st century, energy security and national security are increasingly indistinguishable. Mongolia, the unexpected winner in a 3-way deal. While much of the analysis around this pipeline deal focuses on Russia and China, the 2 major powers with global ambitions, there's a third player whose position deserves attention: Mongolia. Landlocked between 2 giants, Mongolia has historically walked a careful diplomatic tightrope.